The Glass Castle, pages 107 to 117. That's some fine handiwork, Dad said. I'm mighty proud of you, Mountain Goat. When I left the house the next morning, Dad was still asleep. When I came home in the evening, he was gone. Dad had taken to disappearing for days at a time. When I asked him where he'd been, his explanations were either so vague or improbable, I stopped asking. Whenever he did come home, he usually brought a bag of groceries in each arm. We gobbled deviled ham sandwiches with thick slices of onion while he told us about the progress of his investigation into the UMW and his latest money-making schemes. People were always offering him jobs, he explained, but he wasn't interested in work for hire, in saluting and sucking up and brown-nosing and taking orders. You never make a fortune working for the boss man, he said. He was focused on striking it rich. There might not be gold in West Virginia, but there are plenty of other ways to make your pile. For instance, he was working on a technology to burn coal more efficiently, so that even the lowest grade coal could be mined and sold. There was a big market for that, he said, and it was going to make us rich beyond our dreams. I listened to Dad's plans and tried to encourage him, hoping that what he was saying was true, but also pretty certain it wasn't. Money would come in, and with it food, and on the rare occasion that Dad landed an odd job or Mom received a check from the oil company leasing the drilling rights on her land in Texas. Mom was always vague about how big the land was and where exactly it was, and she refused to consider selling it. All we knew is that every couple of months this check would show up and we'd have plenty of food for days at a time. When the electricity was on, we ate a lot of beans. A big bag of pinto beans cost under $1 and would feed us for days. They tasted especially good if you added a spoonful of mayonnaise. We also ate a lot of rice mixed with jack mackerel, which Mom said was excellent brain food. Jack mackerel was not as good as tuna, but was better than cat food, which we ate from time to time when things got really tight. Sometimes Mom popped up a big batch of popcorn for dinner. It had lots of fiber, she pointed out, and she had us salt it heavily because the iodine would keep us from getting goiters. I don't want my kids looking like pelicans, she said. Once when an extra big royalty check came in, Mom bought us a whole canned ham. We ate off it for days, cutting thick slices for sandwiches. Since we had no refrigerator, we left the ham on a kitchen shelf. After it had been there for about a week, I went to saw myself a slab at dinner time and found it crawling with the little white worms. Mom was sitting on the sofa bed eating the piece she'd cut. Mom, the ham's full of maggots, I said. Don't be so picky, she told me. Just slice off the maggoty parts. The inside's fine. Brian and I became expert foragers. We picked crab apples and wild blackberries and pawpaws during the summer and fall. We swiped ears of corn from Old Man Wilson's farm. The corn was tough. Old Man Wilson grew it as feed for his cattle, but if you chewed it long enough, you could get it down. Once we caught a wounded blackbird by throwing a black blanket over it and figured we could make a blackbird pie like in the nursery rhyme. But we couldn't bring ourselves to kill the bird in any way it looks too scrawny to eat. We'd heard of a dish called poke salad, and since a big patch of pokeweed grew behind our house, Brian and I thought we'd give it a try. If it was any good, we'd have a whole new supply of food. We first tried eating the pokeweed raw, but it was awfully bitter, so we boiled it, singing Poke Salad Annie in anticipation. But it still tasted sour and stringy, and our tongues itched for days afterward. One day, hunting for food, we climbed through the window of an abandoned house. The rooms were tiny and had dirt floors, but in the kitchen we found shelves and lined with rows of canned food. Bonanza, Brian cried out. Feast time, I said. The cans were coated with dust and starting to rust, but we figured the food was still safe to eat since the whole point of canning was to preserve. I passed a can of tomatoes to Brian, who took out his pocket knife. When he punctured the tin, the contents exploded in his face, covering us with fizzy brown juice. We tried a few more, but they exploded too, and we walked home without having eaten anything, our shirts and faces stained with rotten tomatoes. When I started 6th grade, the other kids made fun of Brian and me because we were so skinny. They called me spider leg, skeleton girl, pipe cleaner, 2x4, bony butt, stick woman, bean pole, and giraffe, and they said I could stay dry in the rain by standing under a telephone wire. At lunchtime, when the other kids unwrapped their sandwiches or brought home their hot meals, Brian and I would get out books and read. Brian told everyone he had to keep his weight down because he wanted to join the wrestling team when he got to high school. I told people I had forgotten to bring my lunch. No one believed me, so I started hiding in the bathroom during lunch hour. I'd stay in one of the stalls with the door locked and my feet propped up so no one would recognize my shoes. When the other girls came in and threw away their lunch bags in the garbage pails, I'd go retrieve them. I couldn't get over the way kids tossed out all this perfectly good food. Apples, hard-boiled eggs, packages of peanut butter crackers, sliced pickles, half-pint cartons of milk, cheese sandwiches with just one bite taken out because the kid didn't like the pimentos in the cheese. I'd return to the stall and polish off my tasty finds. There was at times more food in the wastebasket than I could eat. The first time I found extra food, a bologna and cheese sandwich, I stuffed it into my purse to take home for Brian. Back in the classroom, I started worrying about how I'd explain to Brian where it came from. I was pretty sure he was rooting through the trash too, but we never talked about it. As I sat there trying to come up with ways to justify it to Brian, I began smelling the bologna. It seemed to fill the whole room. I became terrified the other kids could smell it too, and that they'd turn and see my overstuffed purse, and since they all knew I'd never eat lunch, they'd figure out I'd pinched it from the trash. As soon as class was over, I ran to the bathroom and shoved the sandwich back in the garbage can. Maureen had always plenty to eat, since she had made friends throughout the neighborhood and would show up at their houses around dinner time. I had no idea what Mom and Lori were doing to fend for themselves. Mom weirdly was getting heavier. One evening when Dad was away and we had nothing to eat and we're all sitting around the living room trying not to think of food, Mom kept disappearing under the blanket on the sofa bed. At one point, Brian looked over. "Are you chewing something?" he asked. "My teeth hurt," Mom said, but she was getting all shifty-eyed, glancing around the room, avoiding our stares. "It's my bad gums. I'm working my jaw to increase the circulation." Brian yanked the covers back. Lying in the mattress next to Mom was one of those huge, family-sized Hershey chocolate bars, the shiny silver wrapper pulled back and torn away. She'd already eaten half of it. Mom started crying. "I can't help it," she sobbed. "I'm a sugar addict, just like your father's an alcoholic." She told us we should forgive her the same way we always forgave Dad for his drinking. None of us said a thing. Brian snatched up the chocolate bar and divided it into 4 pieces. While Mom watched, we wolfed them down. Winter came hard that year. Just after Thanksgiving, the first big snow started with fat, wet flakes the size of butterflies. They floated down lazily, but were followed by smaller, drier flakes that kept coming for days. At first, I loved winter in Welch. The blanket of snow hid the soot and made the entire town seem clean and cozy. Our house looked almost like all the others along Little Hobart Street. It was so cold that the youngest, most fragile branches snapped in the frigid air, and very quickly I started feeling it. I still had only my thin wool coat with the buttons missing. I felt almost as cold in the house while we had the coal stove in the coal. There were 42 coal retailers listed in the Welch phone book. A ton of coal, which would last most of the winter, cost about $50, including delivery, or even as little as $30 for the lower grade stuff. Mom said she was sorry, but there was no room in our budget for coal. We'd have to devise other ways to stay warm. Pieces of coal were always falling off the trucks when they made their deliveries, and Brian suggested that I get a bucket and collect some. We were walking along Little Hobart Street, picking up pieces of coal, when our neighbors, the Noys, drove by in their station wagon. The Noy girls, Karen and Carol, were sitting in the backward-facing jump seat looking out the rear window. "We're working on our rock collection," I shouted. The pieces we found were so small that after an hour we'd fill only half the bucket. We needed at least a bucket to keep a fire going for one evening. So we made occasional coal collecting expeditions. We used mostly wood. We couldn't afford wood any more than we could afford coal, and Dad wasn't around to chop and split any, which meant it was up to us kids to gather dead branches and logs from the forest. Finding good dry wood was a challenge. We trekked along the mountainside looking for pieces that weren't waterlogged or rotten, shaking the snow off branches, but we went through the wood awfully quickly. While a coal fire burns hot, a wood fire doesn't throw off much heat. We all huddled around the pot-bellied stove, wrapped in blankets, holding out our hands toward the weak, smoky heat. Mom said we should be thankful because we had better than pioneers who didn't have modern conveniences like window glass and cast iron stoves. One day we got a roaring fire going, but even then we could still see our breath, and there was ice on both sides of the windows. Brian and I still decided we needed to make the fire even bigger and went out to collect more wood. On the way back, Brian stopped and looked at our house. "There's no snow on the roof," he said. He was right. It had completely melted. Every other house has snow on its roof. He said he was right about that too. "This house doesn't have a lick of insulation," Brian told Mom. We got back inside. "All the heat's going right through the roof." "We may not have insulation," Mom said, as we all gathered around the stove, "but we have each other." It got so cold in the house that icicles hung down from the kitchen ceiling. The water in the sink turned into a solid block of ice, and the dirty dishes were stuck there as if they'd been cemented in place. Even the pan of water we kept in the living room to wash up in, usually had a layer of ice on it. We walked around the house wearing our coats, wrapped in blankets. We wore our coats to bed, too. There was no stove in the bedroom, and no matter how many blankets I piled on top of myself, it still felt cold. I lay awake at night, rubbing my feet with my hands, trying to warm them. We fought over who got to sleep with the dogs, Tinkle the Jack Russell Terrier, and Pippin, a curly-haired mutt who would wander down through the woods one day because they kept us warm. They usually ended up in a heap with Mom because she had the bigger body and they were cold too. Brian had bought an iguana at G.C. Murphy, the 5 and Dime on McDowell Street, because it reminded him of the desert. He named the lizard Iggy and slept with it against his chest to keep him warm, but it froze to death one night. We had to leave the faucet under the house dripping or the water froze in the pipe. When it got really cold, the water froze anyway. We wake up to find a big icicle hanging from the faucet. We tried to thaw the pipe by running a burning piece of wood along it, but it would be frozen so solid there was nothing to do but to wait for the next warm spell. When the pipe froze like that, we got our water by melting snow or icicles in the tin pan on the pot-bellied stove. A couple of times when there wasn't enough snow on the ground, Mom sent me next door to borrow a pail of water from Mr. Freeman, a retired miner who lived in the house with his grown son and daughter Peanut and Prissy. He never turned me down outright, but he would look at me for a minute in silence and shake his head and disappear into the house. When he passed out the bucket, he would give me another disgusted head shake, even after I assured him that he'd have as much water from us as he wanted come spring. I hate winter, I told Mom. All seasons have something to offer, she said. Cold weather's good for you. It kills the germs. That seemed to be true because none of us ever got sick, but even if I'd woken up one morning with a raging fever, I never would have admitted it to Mom. Being sick might have meant staying home in a freezing house instead of spending the day in a toasty classroom. Another good thing about the cold weather was that it kept odors to a minimum. By New Year's, we had washed our clothes only once since that first November snowfall. In the summer, Mom had bought a Ringer washing machine like the one we had in Phoenix, and we kept it in the kitchen. When we had electricity, we washed the clothes and hung them on the front porch to dry. Even when the weather was warm, they'd have to stay out there for days because it was always so damp in that hollow on the north side of the mountain. But then it got cold, and one time we did our laundry, it froze on the porch. We brought the clothes inside. The socks had hardened into the shape of question marks, and the pants were so stiff you could lean them against the wall. We banged them against the stove, trying to soften them up. At least we don't need to buy starch, Lori said. Even with the cold, by January we were all so rank that Mom decided it was time to splurge. We would go to the laundromat. We loaded our dirty clothes into pillowcases and lugged them down the hill and up Stewart Street. Mom put the loaded bag on her head the way women in Africa do and tried to get us to do the same. She said it was better for our posture and easier on our spines, but there was no way we kids were going to be caught dead walking through Welch with the laundry bags on our heads. We followed Mom with our bags over our shoulders, rolling our eyes when we passed people to show we agreed with them. The lady with the bag on her head looked pretty peculiar. The laundromat with its windows completely steamed up was warm and damp as a Turkish bath. Mom let us put coins in the washers, then we climbed up and sat on them. The heat from the rumbling machines warmed our behinds and spread through our bodies. When the wash was done, we heaved the armfuls of wet clothes into the dryers and watched them tumbling around as if they were on some fun carnival ride. Once the cycle was over, we pulled out the scorching hot clothes and buried our faces in them. We spread them on the tables and folded them carefully, lining up the sleeves of the shirts and the seams in the pants and balling the paired up socks. We never folded our clothes at home, but the laundromat was so warm and cozy, we were looking for any excuse to extend our stay. A warm spell in January seemed like good news, but then the snow started melting and the wood in the forest became totally soaked. We couldn't get a fire to do anything but sputter smoke. If the wood was wet, we'd douse it with the kerosene we used in the lamps. Dad was disdainful of a fire starter like kerosene. No true frontiersman would ever stoop to use it. It wasn't cheap, and since it didn't burn hot, it took a lot to make the wood catch fire. Also, it was dangerous. Dad said if you got sloppy with kerosene, it would explode. But still, if the wood was wet and didn't want to catch, and we were all freezing, we would pour a little kerosene on it. One day, Brian and I climbed the hillside to try to find some dry wood while Lori stayed in the house stoking the fire. As Brian and I were shaking the snow off some promising branches, we heard a loud boom from the house. I turned and saw flames leap up inside the windows. We dropped our wood and ran back down the hill. Lori was lurching around the living room, her eyebrows and bangs all singed off from the smell of burned hair in the air. She had used kerosene to try to get the fire going better, and it had exploded just like Dad said it would. Nothing in the house except Lori's hair had caught on fire. The explosion had blown back her coat and her skirt, and the flames had scorched her thighs. Brian went out and got some snow, and we packed it on Lori's legs, which were dark pink. The next day she had blisters the length of her thighs. Just remember, Mom said after examining the blisters, what doesn't kill you will make you stronger. If that was true, I'd be Hercules by now, Lori said. Days later, when the blisters burst, the clear liquid inside ran down to her feet. For weeks, the fronts of her legs were open sores, so sensitive she had trouble sleeping under blankets. But by then, the temperature had fallen again, and if she kicked off the blanket, she froze. One day that winter, I went to a classmate's house to work on a school project. Carrie Mae Blankenship's father was an administrator at the McDowell County Hospital, and her family lived in a solid brick house on McDowell Street. The living room was decorated in shades of orange and brown, and the plaid pattern of the curtains matched the couch upholstery. On the wall was a framed photo of Carrie Mae's older sister in her high school graduation gown. It was lit with its own tiny lamp, just like in a museum. There was also a small plastic box on the wall near the living room door. A row of tiny numbers ran along the top under a lever. Carrie Mae's father saw me studying the box while she was out of the room. It's a thermostat, he told me. You move the lever to make the house warmer or cooler. I thought he was pulling my leg, but he moved the lever, and I heard a muffled roar kick on in the basement. That's the furnace, he said. He led me over to a vent in the floor and had me hold my hand above it and feel the warm air wafting upward. I didn't want to say anything to show how impressed I was, but for many nights afterward, I dreamt that we had a thermostat at 93 Little Hobart Street. I dreamed that all we had to do was fill our house with that warm, clean furnace. Heat was just to move a lever. Irma died during the last hard snowfall at the end of our second winter in Welch. Dad said her liver simply gave out. Mom took the position that Irma drank herself to death. It was suicide every bit as much as if she had stuck her head in the oven, Mom said, only slower. Whatever the cause, Irma had made detailed preparations for the occasion of her death. For years she had read the Welch Daily News, only for the obituaries and black-bordered memorial notices, clipping and saving her favorites. They provided inspiration for her own death announcement, which she'd worked and reworked. She'd also written pages of instructions on how she wanted her funeral conducted. She picked out all the hymns, the prayers, chosen her favorite funeral home, ordered a lavender lace nightgown for JCPenney she wanted to be buried in, and selected a two-tone lavender casket with the shiny chrome handles from the mortician's catalog. Irma's death brought out Mom's pious side. While we were waiting for the preacher, she took out her rosary and prayed for Irma's soul, which she feared was in jeopardy since, as she saw it, Irma had committed suicide. She also tried to make us kiss Irma's corpse. We flat out refused, but Mom went up in front of the mourners, genuflected with a grand sweep, and kissed Irma's cheek so vigorously that you could hear the puckering sound throughout the chapel. I was sitting next to Dad. It was the first time in my life I'd ever seen him wearing a necktie, which he always called a noose. His face was tight and closed, but I could tell he was distraught. More distraught than I'd ever seen him, which surprised me because Irma had seemed to have had some sort of evil hold over Dad, and I thought he'd be relieved to be free of it. As we walked home, Mom asked us kids if we had anything nice to say about Irma now that she passed. We took a couple of steps in silence, and Lori said, "Ding dong, the witch is dead." Brian and I started snickering. Dad wheeled around and gave Lori such a cold, angry look, I thought he might wallop her. "She was my mother, for God's sake," he said. He glared at us. You kids make me ashamed. Do you hear me? Ashamed." He turned down the street to Junior's bar, and we all watched him go. "You're ashamed of us," Lori called after him. Dad just kept walking. 4 days later, when Dad still hadn't come home, Mom sent me to go find him. "Why do I always have to go get Dad?" I asked. "Because he likes you the best, and he'll come home if you tell him to." The first step in tracking down Dad was going next door to the Freemans, who let us use their phone if we paid a dime, and calling Grandpa to ask if Dad was there. Grandpa said he had no idea where Dad was. "When y'all going to get your own telephone?" Mr. Freeman asked after I hung up. "Mom disapproves of telephones," I said as I placed the dime on his coffee table. "She thinks they're an impersonal means of communication." My first stop, as always, was Junior's. It was a fancy bar in Welch with a picture window, a grill that served hamburgers and french fries, and a pinball machine. "Hey," one of the regulars called out when I walked in. "It's Rex's little girl. How you doing, sweetheart?" "I'm fine, thank you. Is my dad here?" "Rex?" He turned to the man next to him. "Where's that old polecat Rex?" "I seen him this morning at the Howdy House." "Honey, you look like you use a rest," the bartender said. "Sit down and have a Coca-Cola in the house." "No, thank you. I've got kite supply and fish to fry." I went to the Howdy House, which was a notch below Junior's. It was smaller, darker, and the only food it served was pickled eggs. The bartender told me Dad had gone to the pub, which was a notch below the Howdy House, almost pitch black, with a sticky bar top and no food at all. There he was, in the midst of a few other regulars telling one of his Air Force stories. When Dad saw me, he stopped talking and looked at me the way he did every time I had to track him down in a bar. It was always an awkward moment for us both. I didn't want to be fetching him any more than he wanted to be his ragamuffin daughter summoning him home, like a wayward schoolboy. He looked at me in his cold, strange way for a moment and then broke into a hearty grin. "Hey, Mountain Goat," he shouted, "what the hell are you doing in this dive?" "Mom says you have to come home," I said. "She does she?" He ordered a Coca-Cola for me and another shot of whiskey for himself. I kept telling Dad it was time to go, but he kept putting me off and ordering more shots, as if he had to gulp back a whole bunch of them down before he could face home. He staggered off to the bathroom, came back, ordered one for the road, slammed the shot glass down on the bar, and walked to the door. He lost his foot in trying to open it and sprawled on the floor. I tried to help him, but he kept falling over. "Honey, you ain't getting him nowhere like that," a man behind me said. "Here, let me give you a lift home." "I'd appreciate that, sir," I said, "if it's not out of your way." Some of the other regulars helped the man and me load Dad into the bay of the man's pickup. We propped Dad up against a tool chest. It was late afternoon, early spring. The light was beginning to fade, and people on McDowell Street were locking up their shops and heading home. Dad started singing one of his favorite songs, "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, Coming for to Carry Me Home." Dad had a fine baritone with strength and timbre and range, and despite being tanked, he sang that hymn like the roof raiser it is. I looked over Jordan, and what did I see coming for to carry me home? A band of angels coming after me, coming for to carry me home. I climbed in next to the driver. On the way home, with Dad still singing away in the back, extending the word low so long it sounded like a mooing cow, the man asked me about school. I told him I was studying hard because I wanted to become either a veterinarian or a geologist, specializing in the Miocene period when the mountains out west were formed. I was telling him how geodes were created from bubbles and lava when he interrupted me. "For the daughter of the town drunk, you sure got big plans," he said.